Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, Tuesday, October 10th, 1972. First question I'm going to ask you is your name and your date of birth and your age.
My name is James Ebbinghouse. I was born November the 27th, 1907, and I'm 64 years old.
Jim, were you born right here in Wabash? And tell us about your mother and your father and their occupation, your mother's maiden name, and so forth.
I was born on Stitt Street in Wabash, Indiana. My mother's name was Esther Ross. My father's name is Paul Ebbinghouse. And
Where did you go to school?
I went to the Century School building on Manchester Avenue and then the Wabash High School.
Could you tell us at Century School who some of your teachers and your playmates were back in those days?
Well, of course, there was Fanny McCarty and Miss Plummer and Lucille Craig and Miss Milner.
Who were some of your playmates that you went back and forth to school with and played with at Century School?
Well, there was Kentner Baker and Merle Whistler were two of my closest friends. They're both deceased now, however.
Now we'll move on to your high school days. Of course, you went to Wabash High School. And tell us where the high school was and the teachers and the principal and the general order of business back in those days.
I went to high school at the old high school on Hill Street, and Darnell, I guess, was principal at that time. And then my last year of high school was out at the new building on Miami Street. And some of my teachers were Phil Magner. He taught me chemistry and physics. I had Barnhart, business English. I had Tewksbury and Miss Jones. I had Odette Needham. And Laywell Carpenter. I had math from him.
What kind of, what was the school like in those days, moving out into a new high school from down on Hill Street, and what contrast when you went to high school as the impressions you get of the kids that are going to high school today?
Well, back in those days, everybody rode bicycles. We didn't have automobiles, although I think when I was a senior, I did have a Model T. And you could get those secondhand in those days for about $65, and they were in pretty good shape. But now you go out to the high school, and it looks like the students now are driving automobiles that are about equivalent to what the teachers drive. We didn't have long hair, and we had no dope problem in those days. But the most serious problem then was if they caught you smoking.
What did they do to them when they caught them smoking?
Well, I got sent home a couple of afternoons, and we played hooky, I remember, several of us, and went out to Lucan's Lake swimming in the spring. And I know when Darnell saw the four of us come back in, why, he gave us 3 days, and until he saw me, when I dived in, I'd hit the bottom and scraped the whole front of my face, and it was all scabby, and he got laughing so hard that he said, "I'll go back to school."
What year did you graduate from high school, and then what did you do that summer immediately after graduation?
Well, I graduated in 1928, and then I went to work for the old United Paperboard company, and I worked there about 4 years, and until 1933, when the Depression really hit, and they had a layoff. And I was single at that time, and they almost went by seniority even in those days. But the last fellow laid off had 5 children, and they were going to let me stay. And I said, well, if you lay me off, would you keep this chap on? And they said yes, so I asked for a layoff and got it. I went then up to Honeywell and put in my application, and the World's Fair was on in Chicago in '33, so I went up there and spent a week. And as I drove in the yard, the telephone rang, and it was Honeywell, wanted me to come down and go to work for 2 weeks.
Going back to United Paperboard, that was the now present Container Corporation.
That's right.
And were they still making straw board back in those days? And
They had one small machine they called Sparky that made straw board. In fact, I back-tended on that occasionally. In those days, we worked 13-hour nights and 11-hour days. And if on the opposite shift, if the back-tender didn't come in, I'd work his shift and then go back and work mine. But that was the only machine then that made straw board.
did they still bring the straw in from the country? The farmers bring the straw into the country and sell it to the factory down there?
Not to my knowledge.
Who was the superintendent or some of the employees back at the straw board?
Well, John Baum was superintendent at that time, and of course Buck Nickum was the tower boss. And I remember there was Bill Bland and some Doseys, and a lot of those fellows spent their entire lifetime there.
When you got this phone call from Honeywell's asking you to come to work, what was your first job?
They just started to produce humidistats, and I was a humidistat inspector. Inspected them one at a time, and I'd take about half an hour to 45 minutes for each one.
Where was the factory located those days, and who was your supervisor?
Well, the factory was on West Canal Street, and Phil Magner was my immediate supervisor.
Jim, I'm going to ask you what your career was in the lab and then what happened.
I worked in the laboratory about 4 or 5 years, and I was in charge of life tests. And then they decided to move all engineering to Minneapolis, and they transferred me then to the inspection department.
Did you, when you started in 1933, what was your first meeting with Mr. Honeywell?
Well, he used to come through the shop, of course, every day, and he called everybody by their first name, and he called me Jim, I suppose, for 25 years. Well, I don't know what else you want there on that.
What was your impression of Mr. Honeywell back in those days? Was he active in the business and up to what was going on and the production procedures and testing procedures and so forth?
He was very active in those days, and he walked through the shop, like I mentioned, every day, and called all the employees by their first name. And he would go to Minneapolis maybe 4 or 5 times a year, as I recall, particularly at the board meetings. But he did take an active interest, and particularly in the design and engineering work that was being conducted there.
When you moved to, you were transferred to Minneapolis then, what year was that, and had you... Tell us about the young lady that you married and the date and her maiden name.
Well, I got married on December the 7th, 1935, and I married Phyllis Shivers. And I've always told my wife that December the 7th, more than one battle started on the same day.
And Phyllis's father was at Honeywell's also, Jim?
Yeah, her father was Paul F. Shivers, and at that time he was the plant manager at Wabash.
Then your career proceeded, and what happened with Honeywell after this?
Well, I worked in the inspection department a couple of years, and then I went to the machine shop, and then I became a night foreman in the machine shop. And eventually Charlie Buckland came down as plant manager, and we had no method sheets, no process information. And so he gave me the job as methods engineer and time study engineer. And I was on that job for, I suppose, 4 or 5 years.
Now you were worked right straight through the Depression?
Yes, I worked through the Depression, although we did get cut down to 30 hours for 6 or 7 weeks. But outside of that, why, we worked full time.
Were the plants growing, and were there new locations here in Wabash then?
Well, when I started to work, I was the 20th one punching the clock. And of course, in 40, 41, why, we started to do government work. And of course, the plants expanded. Eventually, we rented the Slimmer building across the street and the old Talbert building, which, of course, is burned down. And later on, we rented the old Ford meter box plant over on South Carroll Street. And we also had a plant over on Wabash Street.
Jim, can you remember any of the particular products that you worked on during those years, and some of the problems that possibly would have developed?
Well, we manufactured a water circulator back in those days, early days, and of course industrial motors and humidistats. Those were the major devices. And eventually, of course, the war came along and materials became scarce, and so the water circulator then was discontinued. However, they did continue to make humidistats and industrial motors and valves.
When the war came on, then I assume that the domestic production dropped and was gradually wartime production took over. And what were some of the products that they developed during the war?
Well, the industrial motor was continuing in production. It was needed in industry, and so those were produced all during the war. The first government job we had was a shell base for a chemical shell, and I remember the only profit the company made on that particular job was the scrap that we sold. And then we made a fire wall device that transferred the pressure of gasoline from the tank to the engine through the firewall on airplanes. We also made heater valves for airplanes that kept the crew warm. And of course, then we got into making telescopes for periscope tanks.
Did the number of employees then climb, and women first came into the factory?
Oh yes, employment got up over 700 down at the downtown plant. And we made every telescope sight that went in tanks used in World War II at Wabash, Indiana.
At the conclusion of the war, then what turn did the manufacturing fates of Honeywell take?
Well, we brought down a number of devices in from Minneapolis to produce diaphragm gas valves, low water cutoffs, a M220 motor, an M87 motor. We made then motorized gas valves. We made an oil valve. Of course, humidistats then came strong into the picture. And lots of days we made over 2,500 humidistats a day. We made flame rods and relays, and about a third of our business was residential, and about a third commercial, and about a third industrial in those days.
What was the labor climate immediately following World War II? Did you have a company union, or had the national unions?
Well, I can't. We had an independent union up until, and I don't know the year, but it was before the Korean War. It was during the Korean War that we got, of course, IUE in here.
What was the working conditions then after World War II? Had they improved or changed any from the time that you started back in the early 30s?
Well, yes. When I went to work for Honeywell, there was no smoking allowed in the factory nor the office, and there was no vacation or paid holidays. And then, after I got on office payroll, why, you got 1 week after 1 year and 2 weeks after 5. And of course, later on, even during the time we had the independent union, We smoked in the factory and smoked in the office, and we got vacations and holiday pay.
All these years now that we've covered, I understand that you continued you know Mr. Honeywell rather well, and at times was his chauffeur. Is that right?
No, I chauffeured him a time or two, but he, of course, had Marvin, his regular chauffeur.
Would you see Mr. Honeywell occasionally? Would he have any personal contact with you, Jim?
Oh, saw him every day. In fact, after the center opened, I ate lunch with him at the Honeywell table probably 3 or 4 or 5 noons a week. And he loved to reminisce, and several times he told us when he was a young chap in Florida, he and his friend were riding their bicycles and they went to a party, and he had made a study of hypnotism. And this particular time, why, he hypnotized a young gal, and when he went to snap her out of it, why, she didn't respond, and they got on their bicycles and just beat the rest of them out of town. But he heard afterwards why she came to by herself in about an hour.
Did Mr. Honeywell, was he, what kind of a person was he? Did he like to joke, and or was he all business all the time when you men had lunch with him?
Oh, no, he was, of course, reserved, but at lunch, why, he loved to reminisce, and we have had men-rig parties where he performed his magic tricks, and he was real good at it, too. And one time out at his lodge, we had a party, and he got out his violin and played the violin and really hooped it up as much as anybody.
What did you do after we get up to World War I here and after World War II and the post-war years? Then what did your Honeywell career, what turn did it take?
Well, I was in charge of production and production control for several years, and then became assistant superintendent. And then a few years later, I was made general superintendent, and I had all departments with the exception of engineering and personnel.
Well,
and accounting.
Had Mr. Shivers retired by this time, Jim?
Well, he had gone, moved to Minneapolis, or transferred there in 1941. And then we had a plant manager, Charlie Buckland. And after he left, Stan Nichols was here for a year or two. And I think it was in 1944 that Howard Worth then became the general manager. And he was manager of operations then until 1962.
What was the move from the downtown area out to the Bond Street area like? Do you remember that pretty well?
Oh yes, that was a mess. We transferred, of course, the machines and tried to maintain production. And at the same time, we were making a Hopkins case here for our Minneapolis plant. And at that time, employment got up to a few over 1,200. We were the largest employer in town at that time.
Jim, tell me about your business career since Honeywell's moved out here to Bond Street. What your occupation and job titles and so forth have been?
Well, I was still general superintendent. We still had the Ford plant. And then we had a change in top management, and Ensler became manager of operations. And, of course, he made some changes, and I was still general superintendent for several months after he arrived, and then he brought Bill Dreyer in as factory manager. And I had then production control and production planning and purchasing for I imagine a year or two. And then in 1965, well, let's see, in about 1964, Bill Dreyer became factory manager, and for a short period of time. And then 1965, Bill Fay became factory manager, and at that time I was a security officer and worked in production planning.
During this period when they brought the men in from Freeport, did you ever think that possibly Honeywell was going to close this plant, Jim?
Well, there's been, of course, a lot of talk, particularly in the factory, but I've always felt that as long as this was the home of the Honeywell end of the business, why they'd always maintain a plant here. On how big or a scale it'd be, why, I have no idea. But I have always felt that there'd always be a plant in Wabash.
Did you feel that the employees' morale possibly dipped at that period of time in the career?
Well, I think it has. I think that we've had our ups and downs in employment, and particularly the better employees, why they finally get a job and they get called back and they'd think, well, maybe the plant's going to move out of town after all, so I'll just stay where I am. So we have lost a lot of excellent employees, I think, due to this reason.
Well, Jim, now we're approaching the end of your career, and now what occupation title do you hold here at Honeywell?
Well, I'm a supervisor of the humidistat department, and I'm still security officer until the 1st of November.
And then you're going to retire, is that correct?
Well, I'll retire at the end of November.
Looking back over spending a whole lifetime here, other than the couple of years that you worked at the paper factory, what are your impressions? You glad you had this career, or what? Just exactly what are your impressions?
Well, Honeywell, I think, has been a good place to work. It has been for me. My career is kind of checkered. It's gone from practically nothing up to general superintendent, and then it's due to changes in management and so on, I have, of course, gone downhill. But I still have always enjoyed working in Honeywell, and I think they've certainly treated me fairly, and to the best of my knowledge, I've treated their employees very, very cleanly and fairly.
What are your plans when you retire at the end of November?
Well, I live on a lake about 30 miles north of here, and I intend to fish a lot and hunt, and I want to play some golf, and I've got a seawall to put in, and I've got enough jobs lined up to keep me busy for the next 5-10 years.
Is there any other comments that you would possibly have about Mr. Honeywell, since we're doing really a story on Honeywell employees and Mr. Honeywell in relationship with the employees?
Well, I can remember a few instances that happened with Mr. Honeywell. One time, Howard Worth and Mr. Honeywell and I were going to Logansport, and Marvin, his chauffeur, was driving along, and he never exceeded 55 miles an hour when Mr. Honeywell was along. And a new Oldsmobile passed us, and had a lot of colored folks in it. And Mr. Honeywell said, "Jim, what kind of a car is that?" And I said, "Well, that's a new Oldsmobile." And he mentioned, "Gee," he says, "I wished I could afford one of those." And at that same day, we got on the train the Pennsylvania train at Logansport. He and I were going to Minneapolis, and Howard Worth was going to Chicago. And we went in the diner, and we looked at the menu, and of course I had the Pennsylvania legend on the front. And he says, "Jim, have you ever seen this?" And he flipped the menu over, and he got out his pen, and he made almost an exact duplicate of that real fancy English script Pennsylvania Railroad insignia.
Did you ever have any contact with Mrs. Honeywell in those years, or ever meet her? Or
The original?
First Mrs. Honeywell, yes. How about the second Mrs. Honeywell?
Yes, I've met her and talked to her a number of times. Very, very, very gracious woman.
What activities did you have outside the factory the days that you were working here at Honeywell? What civic and church and social activities did you partake in the community?
Well, I was a charter member of the Wabash Country Club, and I played quite a bit of golf in those days. I've loved to fish and hunt, and of course during the war years, why we worked 7 days a week, and I worked 3 or 4 nights a week, incidentally with no overtime pay.
Jim, you have children? And where are they now?
I have 2 children. I have Ann. She is Mrs. Don Gillespie, and she lives in Lincolnville. And then I have a daughter, Susan, who lives in Indianapolis, and she married Mike Wilcox. And Susan has 1 boy, and Ann has a boy and a girl.
I'm going to ask you some questions now, or just some words. I'm going to give you some words, and just give me your impressions right off the top of your head on them. Depression.
Well, I remember 1933 real well. You get 7 gallons of gasoline for $1. Lots of people worked shuck corn for $1 a day. But I was one of the fortunate ones. I did work.
Do you remember when the Ku Klux Klan was in its height here in Wabash after World War I, and anything you know about that? You know, there's very little written about that.
Well, I don't know much about it. I remember that they burned some crosses south of town up through the cut there on the high hill. But I didn't know any Ku Kluxers, and I don't think they were too active here in town, although I think one of the Grand Dragons or something lived here.
I'll be done. Who was that? Yes, I've heard that. We've been doing a little on the Depression and the Ku Klux Klan and that because, as I say, there's very little written on that. How about when I mentioned the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt?
Well, I remember my friend's radio program where he'd come on and talk about my friends, and I know that a lot of towns around here cashed in on the WPA, but Wabash was always Republican, and I think we got the short end of the stick here.
How about Phil Magner Sr.?
He's one of the best men that I've ever been my privilege to know. I had him as a scout, a master, and I took physics and chemistry from him in high school, and then I worked for him for a number of years with Honeywell.
How about Houston Woods? Do you remember him?
Just vaguely. He had left, been transferred out of Wabash, or left the company before I went to work for them.
How about the impression of your father-in-law, Paul Shivers?
Well, he had one of the only people that I ever knew that had instant recall. He could read something and recall it almost word for word 20 years later. He was really uneducated, but he was one of the smartest engineers that's ever been my pleasure to know.
How about the interurbans?
Oh, yeah, I remember those real well. Yeah, I used to go to Peru. I used to ride those to Fort Wayne to catch a Pennsylvania. And I think if they'd have just could have stood another couple, 3 years, they would have really come into their own during the war.
What would you say in your lifetime has been the greatest piece of progress? Albert Watson the other day told me it was the telephone. Some say it's the radio, some say it's electricity, some say it's the modern automobile. What would your impressions be during your lifetime?
Well, the thing I think that impressed me most was the airplane. I remember when the service motor truck company had their own planes, and every time you hear one, why, everybody would run outdoors and look up in the sky and see if they could see it. But that, I think, impressed me more than anything else.
You remember your first airplane ride?
Oh, yes, yeah. It was in a service motor truck plane, and I think they took them up at that time for something like $3, and another chap and I kind of crowded in ahead, I think, and as I recall, we had dates that night, and so we jumped in, and the pilot sat in front, and 2 of us sat behind him, and there was no straps or anything to hang on to, and he really gave us a rough ride. And we were about green when we got out of that plane.
Do you think that the town has changed much in the years that you've lived here? And
Oh yes, it's changed considerably. There's a lot of more houses, and of course we have now the shopping centers, and they have dolled up the downtown. And yeah, of course I think it'd be more impressive to somebody that had been away from Wabash for a number of years. My sister-in-law was here just last week, and she hadn't been here for 15 years, and she noticed so many changes, and she thought the town had improved quite a bit.
how about Mosworth, Jim?
Well, he was probably the most dedicated manager that this plant has ever had. He worked and sweat and to get new jobs in the plant from Minneapolis, and there was no monkey business with him. He'd go through these plants every Saturday and Sunday to make sure that the water fountains were turned off and the motors were off. And so I went through them Saturday and early before he'd get the chance to do it. And but every once in a while I'd miss something, and if I did, at 5 minutes after 8, I'd get a telephone call, and he'd say, "Jim, can I see you a few minutes?" And then he would tell me what I'd missed.
Do you think that women working in the plant have made much difference from the time you started?
Well, there's lots of jobs that I think a woman can do better than a man, particularly on small part assemblies and so on. They're more adept with their fingers, and they can do repetitive jobs more easily and more sustained time than a man can.
Jim, how about some of the other old employees that you remember back over the years?
Well, of course, Phil Lobb worked here when I was already working here when I came to work, and of course he had worked on the old generator that Mr. Honeywell had invented that put pressure on a hot water system. And he eventually became a janitor, a night watchman. And of course there was Floyd Circle, and of course Mickey McDaniel, and there's been of course hundreds and hundreds of them that gone through the doors since I came to work here, hundreds of them.
The last thing that I think we'll cover now, Jim, is Mr. Honeywell's funeral, and of course your part in the funeral and your impression and so forth.
Of course, I remember his funeral very well. It was down at the community center, and I was a pallbearer at his funeral.
This is Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, George Dingledy, interviewer.